So we're going to move on to Davie Donaldson from Romano Lab, who will be telling us about Sacred Places of Scotland's Travellers. Davie is a Scottish traveller advocate and social justice campaigner. He supports decision makers at local, national and international level to increase inclusivity of policy and practice towards Gypsy and traveller peoples. Over to you, Davie.
Thank you so much. And can I just say that was a fantastic presentation as well, and I learned so much. I think it's just shocking, and I'll talk a bit more about this in my presentation, but it's shocking that there are so many seldom heard histories in Scotland that, yeah, really need to be spoken about. So no, thank you so much, and I've learned so much of that. But in some ways, I don't really want to follow it. But yes, I'm Davie Donaldson. I'm a Scottish traveller activist, and today I'm going to be speaking about the sacred places of Scotland's travellers. Sorry, I'm not used to not clicking. Erin, are you able to click there? Amazing. So just a brief overview of, I suppose, what I'm going to try and fit into this quite short time frame. But I'm going to try and explore a little bit around who Scotland's Gypsy travellers are and really unpack that terminology. Many of you may have seen the term Gypsy traveller in policy and in legislation, but actually the terminology doesn't represent or reflect what actually happens on the grassroots level and what is enacted in daily life through people's lived experience. So I'm going to unpack that terminology. Then we'll explore how place is significant to Scottish traveller peoples, and I will introduce the concept of sacredness and explore how this concept can be effectively recognised in the Scottish heritage sector, but more broadly by us as individuals. Could you click there? Amazing. So who are Gypsy travellers? When we use this terminology, who are the communities that we're actually talking about? And in a way, the term Gypsy traveller hides quite a lot of meaning. There are many different communities who have been homogenised into this term over the decades, even centuries. When we use this terminology, who we're talking about are the Scottish travellers, who are an Indigenous people to Scotland. Their oral history placing them as far back as the 9th century in Scotland. In their own language, the Nacan. Then we have the Irish travellers, who, as the name may suggest, are Indigenous to Ireland. They have their own separate language. Again, early records in the 5th century place them in Ireland as the Anloch Shul, the walking people. In their own language, they're the Pavi or the Minker. Then you have Romany gypsies. So I suppose the classic image when many people imagine Gypsy people, they imagine the wagon, the painted wagon with the horses. That image is mostly linked to the Romany gypsy culture. And Romany gypsies, whilst predominantly living in England and Wales today, they originate in the Punjab region of northern India. And then you have the Welsh gypsies as well, who again primarily live in Wales but travel throughout Scotland seasonally for work. Now, Erin, I wanted to click, see where it's highlighted there. There's a little link to a video. Are you able to do that? Amazing. Is that working, Erin? If it doesn't, then we can just go on and it's okay. Oh, okay. No worries. Apologies, I'm not used to not clicking, and I'm quite a control freak. Basically, what Erin's about to load up is a short animation. Due to the time frame, I didn't want to spend too much time going into who each of the groups are, but it's crucial that we do have a recognition and understanding of that. So friends of mine have made a video that summarises it much quicker than I ever could. So that's what this is.
Gypsies, Roma and travellers are three words that stand for a lot of different people. Just like with everyone, Gypsy, Roma and traveller people have things in common with each other, and some things that are different. To understand this story now, it's important to go back to the beginning. Living in one place is a recent thing. People were nomads for 99% of our history, travelling around to survive. Then about 10,000 years ago, something changed. People realised that if they grew crops, harvested and stored them, they would have a better chance of surviving hard times. Where people had tracked animals or travelled with their herds, settled farming became the norm. But not everyone changed their ways. Many people didn't want to settle down, or bad harvests, droughts, floods, war would send them back on the move. In Britain and Ireland, nomadic peoples were probably well established by about 1000 AD. There were the Celtic traveller peoples, the Irish travellers who called themselves the Parvi or Mincas, and across the Irish Sea there were the Scottish travellers, the Norkin. They had their own languages. The Irish travellers talked the Gammon, and the Scottish travellers spoke the Bualadh Ragad. Both have sometimes been called the Cant. Some travellers worked the land. Others were musicians and storytellers who brought entertainment and news to the people of the countryside. Some were horse dealers, tinsmiths and metalworkers. For centuries they lived in tents and travelled mostly on foot. One traditional name for the Irish travellers was An Lucht Shul, which means the walking people. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, a people called the Roma or Romanis had been travelling west, starting from northwest India. The word Roma comes from an old word Rom, meaning man or husband. It isn't related to Rome or Romania, they just look similar. In the late 1400s, a group arrived in Scotland. They were received by King James IV. They told fortunes, had exotic-looking clothes, darker skin and an Indian language. Romani. They stood out from everyone else and were referred to as Egyptians, a word that eventually turned into gypsies. As time went on, they did much of the same work as other travellers. Some were specialists in other trades, like wickerwork, charcoal burning, even pearl fishing and snake catching. In the 1500s and 1600s, there were some attempts to expel them from the land. In some cases, people were deported across the sea, or even hanged for being gypsies. But by the 1700s, Romani gypsies lived all over Britain. Some families mixed with the travellers who were already here. Down in England and Wales, like elsewhere, most nomads lived in tents made from arched sticks stuck in the ground with canvas on top. But some gypsies and travellers put their tents on flat carts to keep them off the cold, wet ground. The traveller's wagon was born. The bow-top became a common sight in Ireland as well as Britain. Later, wagons were purpose-built in various shapes and sizes. Mobile works of art. Over the years, travellers went back and forth across the Irish Sea and the borders of mainland Britain. Some worked on the canals and motorways, fought in wars for their country, and many became self-employed. They did jobs like scrap metal collecting, roofing, flower selling, and tarmacking, trades you could take on the move, trades that continue today. Romani people from other parts of Europe continued to come, in small numbers at first, with more arriving in the 21st century. So those three words, gypsies, Roma, travellers, they hide a lot of meaning. They get used in lots of ways, but they're just the names of people, like English, Indian, or Italian. Over the years, some travelling people have settled down. Some move less often, and others hardly at all. But however they live, they take their languages, memories, and cultures with them. They are proud of their roots and their family, and why shouldn't they be? After all, if you go back far enough, there's a traveller in every story.
Thanks very much for that, Erin. So yeah, that's just a brief overview of what we mean by when we're using the term gypsy traveller, but also a little bit about the history and the origins of each people. I'll let you get back to the presentation now, Erin. Amazing. And feel free to click to the next one. Grand. So today, though, we're going to be focusing largely on Scottish travellers, or in our own language, the Nacan. This is principally because I am myself a Scottish traveller. It'd be disingenuous if I tried to represent another community. My lived experience is principally from a place of Scottish travellers. But it's also the majority of the Gypsy traveller community in Scotland, or the largest demographic, I should say, are Scottish travellers. So today when we're going to be speaking about this community, one that is vastly considered Indigenous, as the video mentioned and as I did before. Our oral accounts place us as far back as the 9th century. We have always been a distinct grouping, and I'll go and speak about that a little bit more, but it wasn't until 2008 when we were granted our ethnic minority status, making us the last nomadic people to be granted ethnic identity status other than the show people in mainstream Britain. We are historically nomadic, but it's important and indeed crucial that we understand that to be a traveller doesn't mean to be nomadic. Many of our community live in houses, as do I, for a portion or all of the year. And many of our community as well have perhaps lived in houses for generations. Doesn't make them any less of a traveller as it is an ethnic minority status. We do have a unique belief system and heritage. Part of that as well is our language. The video briefly mentioned Bula Regard, which is considered to be our Indigenous language, with the grammatical structure of ancient Gaelic. Now, that language is mainly used by older people in our community now, or by families who live in the Hebrides or the west of Scotland more generally. The most commonplace language is the Cant, which has its origins around the 1500s as a marketplace language. And through that language, we have links to ancient Norse, Old English, and a lot of our words would have been spoken by settled people at that time, but are falling into disuse by the dominant society. Our population numbers are controversial. The official population sits around 4,500 people, but NGOs and activists would claim that number to be massively inaccurate. And that's because of the fear that many travellers have when actually ticking the box on a census or registering as Gypsy travellers in the education or the health system. And many don't do it for the sole reason of discrimination and worry that they'll be treated differently. And so the real population is estimated to be between 50,000 and 60,000 people in Scotland. You can click there, Aaron. So whilst the video spoke a little bit generally about history, I want to focus in on Scotland and really focus in on the key points or the key milestones in our history, which we as a society have to understand when it comes to understanding the relations that travellers have with settled people, and more importantly, the heritage and the relationship with place. Now, if we go back to 1100, that was the first time that Scottish travellers were mentioned in any form of documentation. And we were mentioned in King David's Farnman laws. Now, these laws were set out principally to protect travelling salespeople, but the interesting thing about these laws were that they mentioned tinklers, as we were then called, as a complete separate grouping to other peddler people who would be travelling salespeople. And what that shows us, as well as the fact that we were recognised as a distinct group, is that we weren't solely travelling for trade, but that we were a pre-existing nomadic people. And that's a point that, while starting in 1100, hasn't been fully recognised till today, and something I will return to. It wasn't until 1505 where we had the first record of a gypsy, or as it was then called, the group was then called Egyptians. Now in 1505, King James IV met a band of travelling gypsy people outside Stirling. Now, in my own family history, the story is that there was a cart, and the king was in like a wagon, and the wheel came off, and he was stuck at the side of the road. And as the travellers were moving through, and the gypsy people were moving through, they supported the king and they helped the king to get help, basically. And because of that, the leader of that band of gypsies was proclaimed the King of Little Egypt. And he was given a palace in Kirkyetom. The palace still exists today. It's a B&B called the Gypsy Palace. And he was invited to Holyrood Palace, where his sisters danced for the king and where he banqueted with nobility. Now, this was massively important to Gypsy people, not least because they were people of colour, right? And we heard really importantly there from Lisa around the history of people of colour and Black communities in Scotland, but this again is a part of that history which isn't often spoken about. So he was regarded as a noble, and he was treated with massive honour. But the attitude towards Gypsy people and the attitude towards travellers shifted massively into the 1560s and then into the 1570s, where we had an act getting passed called the Egyptians Act. Now, this act meant that to be nomadic was a crime, and that travellers and Gypsy people, by extension, therefore, would have to stop travelling or to leave Scotland entirely. This then progressed, and eventually we came to the place where it was an offence, offence punishable by death to travel. And so we had many travellers and Gypsy people being hanged for the then crime of travelling. And the last known examples of this happened in the Grassmarket in Edinburgh around 1704. And these were two traveller women, Agnes Bailey and Jean MacArthur. And these two people were, one of them was pregnant, Agnes was pregnant, and they were taken publicly to the Grassmarket and hanged for the sole crime that they'd been caught travelling in Scottish lands. Then we move into 1714 and we saw a massively different punishment. Now travellers were being sent from Scotland, forcibly sent, I should say, from Scotland abroad. And we do have an example in 1714 of 10 Scottish travellers being sent to a slave plantation in Virginia, again for the sole reason that they were travellers. And it's crucial that we recognise that over these few hundred years of policy, travellers and Gypsy people were really, the stereotypes towards them, I should say, were set in stone. That's when we saw these stereotypes really coming into play. Stereotypes like travellers are thieves, travellers will steal children, travellers don't pay tax. These stereotypes have their origins in the 1500s and the early 1700s, and they were used as methods or as tools to allow these policies to further marginalise and in some cases actually kill travellers, to try and validate those actions. Now, the last point or the milestone in history I'd like to share comes from 1895. And this point in history shows us the report on what they termed the Tinker problem. Now, this was a report that was done between the state and the church and looked at finding recommendations around how they would deal with Scottish travellers. Now, the main recommendation of this report was eradication is the only cure. Now, what they meant by that was they felt there was hope for younger travellers, for traveller children, but that there wasn't any hope for older travellers. They were too set in what they called the primitive way of life. And so from around 1896 until arguably the late 1970s, early 1980s, we saw a massive push within the social work and state relations with travellers where they would remove traveller children from their families to reform them, as they put it. And they would board these children out to settled families in the countryside, or they would forcibly migrate these children abroad. I don't have the time to speak about it in depth today, but one of the books I'd like to recommend to everyone if you're interested is called Never to Return, and it was written by a traveller man who was removed from his family in the early 1940s, and it shows his journey through social care. Erin, could you click there? Yeah. So another key change that this 1895 report brought around was segregation. It's not something we're usually told about in Scotland, but segregation did happen here towards Scottish travellers and Gypsy people. Now, the first example I'd like to share is the Bobbin Mill. Now, you'll see on this slide, it looks kind of like a little hut. And that's effectively what they were. They were shacks that were built. Now, the Bobbin Mill is a hugely important landmark to Scottish travellers, but it isn't important for any positive reason. The Bobbin Mill lies in Perthshire, just outside Pitlochry, and it was built in the late 1930s. It was built as a direct result of similar reserves that were built in North America. Indeed, newspaper articles from the time state the positive impact that reserves had on Native American and First Nations peoples, and that the same thing could be done to reform the primitive nomads of Scotland and more acutely in Perthshire. Now, not only does that cause concern, but of course, the way in which it was enacted causes great concern. The church and the state travelled round Perthshire to traveller families who were camped and told them that if they refused to move into these huts, that they would have their children removed from them. And so many travellers made a very, very difficult decision to move into these huts and to give up their nomadic way of life, falling into massive poverty because, of course, their trades were inherently nomadic, so they couldn't work. And many of them had severe health conditions as a result. There was no running water, there was no facility to really speak of in these huts, and they were very, very cold. So families who had been used to living in tents, which were quite warm, moved into these huts and faced massive health difficulties as a result. And the families who continue to live there to this day, many have moved, of course, but there are some who continue, talk about the cultural trauma which this really created within their family and within them more acutely, which impacted on their mental health. And that's something I'll return to. Now, the second example I'd like to share is segregated schooling. Now, it's important to recognise this happened across the country. It happened all the way from Kent right up to the very north of Scotland. But the specific example here comes again from Pitlochry, and it was termed a little school at Aldur. And this school was built as a direct consequence of settled people not wanting their children to go to school with travellers. There was a number of settled families who wrote to the Education Board at the time and insisted that they would not put their children to school until the tinkers had been removed. And so what the Education Board did was they built a separate, again, like a little hut where traveller children could be educated so that settled people could go back to school. Now, those who experienced this schooling spoke about the curriculum being very rudimental, teachers being voluntary, and the treatment of traveller children in this school was dire. It was diabolical. Many of the travellers who went through it spoke of the trauma that this placed on them, but being punished for speaking their own language and their education being a tuppence. Many of them believing the teachers didn't think they would do anything with an education, so they shouldn't have been educated in the first place. Now, both of these examples obviously should take place within mainstream discussions around human rights, but also within mainstream discussions around heritage. But sadly, they're very rarely spoken about. And that's something, again, that I'd like to really catalyse from today, is that discussion around these forms of segregation and how us as a society can better reflect them in heritage. Erin, could you click? Yeah. Now, the last point I'd like to mention, and I've briefly alluded to it already, was the forced migration of traveller children. Now, from 1896 until the 1970s, it was common practice within social work to remove Scottish traveller children from their families, the belief being that a traveller environment was detrimental to a child's development. Now, many children that were torn away from their families talk about the abuse that they faced in care and the sexual abuse and the physical abuse. And to be honest, to this day, we still don't fully recognise the extent to which this impacted on the community, as many of those numbers and details just weren't gathered. But we do know that it was in the tens of thousands of children who were boarded out and forcibly migrated abroad to places like Canada, Australia, and the USA as well. But many travellers claim it didn't end in the 1970s, and that forced adoption is still a very real issue within the community today, and that travellers are still disproportionately taken into care. It is still a massive issue in our community. So whilst I speak about this in a historical perspective, it's crucial that we don't lose the fact that this is still an ongoing issue. Could we click it? Yeah, I see that, Nicola. Is I think a bit of tech difficulty used up a few of my minutes, so I'm going to try and storm through these slides. Now, cultural trauma is something that is crucial when we're talking about Scottish travellers and when we're talking about how we view sacred places. I don't have the time now to go into this massively, but just to quickly skim the top of it, there are substantial health inequalities faced by the Scottish Gypsy traveller community, many of them coming from mental health. So some examples are here on the slide. We have high depression rates, we have higher suicide rates, and we have higher infant mortality, and our life expectancy is at least 10 years younger than the settled community. Now, a lot of that is claimed to come from cultural trauma and the trauma that the heritage of persecution has placed on our community. Erin, could you click there? Now, this isn't just backed up by academic research. Again, I'll share all this after because I don't really have the time to go into it. But this isn't just backed up with academic research, but it's backed up by community views. And that's something that I think is so, so important that we recognise. Now, when you speak to the community, which I did, about those health inequalities, when you show them those health inequalities, these are some of the things that are said. We've lost the old way of life. It's harder now. How can we trust? Tell me, how can we trust when they took our wains? Then they speak the cant, the country folk, settled people, will ken and you'll be the worse for it. And try raising your bairns when society is against you. They'll never accept our way. They never have. It's like for us to be in trailers makes us them's enemy. Now, this to me was massively impactful, not least because not once did they speak about health, right? When I said, what do you think are causing these health inequalities? This is what they said. And to me, that further compounds that this is coming from a deep sense of cultural trauma and a deep sense of their belonging not being represented or reflective within Scotland. Please do click there, Aaron. Now, this brings me to place. And with all this in mind, how do we tackle cultural trauma? Now, when we talk about place and the relationship which travellers have with place, we need to talk about what I call the trinity of place. And that is that place isn't solely somewhere that is inhabited, it's not solely for accommodation, but rather it's for heritage, it's for health. Now, when we talk about the trinity, it's crucial that we're speaking about cultural resilience here. Now, those three parts have to come together when we reflect place and the heritage of place. Otherwise, it lacks the meaning and lacks the true reflection of how travellers see and experience the place in which they're in. Please do click there, Erin. Did you click? No, sorry. Oh, grand, thank you. Now, one of the key ways in which we experience place is through shifting. Now, when we go shifting, that's when we travel. That's really when settled people tend to see us as a community. It's when we, I suppose, are most visible within society. Now, when we travel for different reasons, but the key way in which we travel, or the key reason in which we travel for, is to learn about ourselves. It's the only place where young travellers can learn about their sense of belonging, their history, their family genealogy. Our histories and our experiences of self are inherently bounded within place. Now, when we travel to these places and we cook traditionally outside, it's where we learn again our traditional meals. But even on a deeper level than that, it's where we learn our story that's bounded within our landscape. We're taught ballads, ancient ballads, some dating back as far as the 12th century. We're taught stories and song. Now, these are the things which are important to us to recognise and place our people in history and in context, because there is no book that we can lift and learn the history of Scottish travellers. Please click. Yeah. Now, when we travel as well, it's not solely to learn about the histories of our people, but it's actually within our lived identity and lived experience. And yes, of course, this expands to our love life as well. Now, when we talk about kinship and courting, it's explicitly linked to the road. We have no explicit dating within our community. It's deemed a taboo issue. Instead, we run away, as we call it, and we travel onto the road with our partner. And when we do this, we travel to specific places which are historically significant to our people. Now, two of these places are the Tinker's Heart and the Lomond Rock. The Lomond Rock, of course, being at Loch Lomond, and the Tinker's Heart being Argyll. And we go to these places and we touch the rock, and that sanctifies our relationship. It blesses our partnership. Please click there. I'm conscious I've just run out of time as well.
Davie,
Yeah.
you've been donated an extra 5 minutes from Graham Campbell, so enjoy them.
Amazing. No, thank you. I'll quickly get through these. Now, when we talk about our relationship with place, and I've already alluded to it through kinship and courting, but it is a sacred relationship. And I appreciate that many of you hearing me say that today will be shocked that I'm using the term sacred in any other context other than referring to perhaps a religious building, such as a cathedral or a church. But it's crucial that we reframe the term sacred. Of course, sacred doesn't solely mean a religious building, but actually what it means is a spiritual relationship with place. And that spiritual relationship has been colonized by organized religion for many centuries now. But many communities, especially Indigenous communities, have a spiritual relationship with place, which is rarely spoken about and which is actually often intangible. Now, building on that understanding, when we speak about the definition, we're speaking about a place which is crucially important to a spiritual relationship between a person, an individual, or importantly, a group. And so my argument is, building upon understandings of other academics such as Mackenzie and Davie, is that we redefine and reframe sacred to mean something much larger than solely a religious building, but in fact, a spiritual relationship with place, of which the Scottish Travellers or the Nakin people have in abundance. Please do click there, Aaron. Now, one case study comes from the Tinker's Heart. Now, this is the only recognised scheduled ancient monument of Scottish travellers in Scotland. It's been in use since at least the 1600s, being laid by widows and daughters of fighters in the Battle of Culloden who passed away. And this is linked with the history of internal colonialism, right? It was found in a cow field with dung, it was trodden over, it wasn't protected. And a movement in 2015 allowed for it to be protected. But there are many of these sites across the country, and the fact this is the only one that has been protected shows again a colonial relationship to sacredness, and again it shows you how marginalised communities are seldom heard in the whole discussion around what classes as sacred. Please do click there, Aaron. Now, when we talk about these places and when we talk about the sacredness, we need to explore what sacredness actually means to Gypsy traveller communities themselves. And all of this comes back to how we produce Nakin, how we produce traveller identity. Now, you cannot just wake up one day, move into a caravan and claim to be a traveller. It doesn't work that way. But there is some degree of strength in the argument that you have to travel or you have to have a relationship with sacred places in order to be a traveller. Now, one of the comments, and again, I've put it in there, is you can take the traveller out of the road. You cannot take the road out of the traveller. Now, this shows the deep boundedness that land has, and indeed the understanding of land has within the Nakin community. Nakin communities continually speak about their identity as being in the blood, but that these stopping places, the stopping places in which they live, are imbued with sacred meaning. One community member explained that once camped, her grandfather would tell the ancient Nakin stories, explaining that he took on the mantle and he lived that person. Now, this wording clearly shows the energy of traveller ancestors still living within these sacred spaces, and that it is the practice of living these ancient stories that convey the deep knowledge of the land to the Nakin. Therefore, the relationship Nakin have with the land cannot be deemed passive, but rather they are actants upon place, and place is an actant upon them. In other words, landscapes are culture before they are nature. Please do click there, Erin. Now, I'm going to skim over these points because I've run out of time, but generously been given another minute. I think that heritage can take the lead here by doing three things. Using tangible visualization to make intangible heritage tangible. And what I mean by that is physically documenting the history and the relationship, the spiritual relationship that travellers have with land in these places. That could be done with QR codes, for example, where ballads of travellers could be uploaded onto a database, and that could be scanned and heard in the place where they belong. Building community cohesion, heritage has a responsibility to protect the heritage of communities, but all communities. So how can we build a more inclusive dialogue with traveller communities to make sure that community cohesion is built and that people are included in that discussion? And lastly, ensuring that we all, and broadly within the heritage sector, protect not only the history of yesterday, but the history of tomorrow. It's crucial we reflect the needs of stopping places for travellers in protecting the heritage of nomadism in Scotland, but importantly in protecting the history that we're going to reflect back on in 100 years' time. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry I had to cut it short, and thank you so much for the extra 5 minutes.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Davie. I think everybody's learned an awful lot there. And I was particularly interested in what you were saying about the sacredness of place. And it made me think of the Borough Charter in particular. Is that something that you engage with particularly? Yeah, I would have thought.
It is, yeah. And especially a lot of my friends across in Ireland have moved on quite a bit more than we have here in Scotland, most notably in the Republic, of course. Scottish Traveller language and crafts are deemed intangible heritage and protected by the UN.
Yeah, so things are a little bit more advanced there. We've got a way to go in Scotland, but you will get there. Thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. And I think a really interesting contrast to the one that went before. And again, I feel like we've had an awful lot of information there to process. And I love the idea of the tinker's heart. It just sounds really interesting. Somebody in the chat has posted a link to a Wikipedia page on that, so I'll have to look at that in the break. So we're going to go for a break now. We're going to come back at 11:05. Feel free to switch off your videos if you have those on, and we'll come back to you then for another 2 chats before we go on to our question and answer session for the morning. Thanks, everybody.